A key component to rhetorical analysis involves thinking very carefully about the rhetorical situation of a text. Now, um, I'm hoping that in English 111, you guys kind of talked a little bit about the rhetorical situation and how it influences your own writing. But if this is all brand new to you, don't worry. I'm going to cover it pretty well. But if for some of you this is a review, but you're going to be asked to look at it a little bit differently. So, understanding the rhetorical situation of a text is really crucial to understanding or doing a rhetorical analysis. And you can think of the rhetorical situation as the context or set of circumstances out of which we write arises. At any time anyone is trying to make an argument, you're doing so out of a particular context, one that influences and shapes the argument that is made. When we do a rhetorical analysis, we look carefully at how the rhetorical situation shapes the act of writing. Now, I know that sounds a little bit complicated, so I'm going to water it down a little bit and examine the rhetorical situation piece by piece. So there are 4 major parts of the rhetorical analysis, 3 of which you guys are intimately familiar with because you have to think about those when you write yourself, when you're writing your own essays. And this one, it's called exigence. Sounds like an eggy, delicious breakfast dish, but it is not. Exigence, the author, purpose, and audience. Those are our 4 major components, and I'm going to talk about them each individually. But before I do that, I want to talk about there's the 2 different ways we can view the rhetorical situation. There's kind of 2 applications. And the first application is within our own writing, right? We look at who we are as an author, what we are asked to do, what our purpose is, and who we intend to reach, who's our audience, and how do we kind of cater our language to kind of achieve that intended purpose. And that's important when you're looking at creating your own texts. But for a rhetorical analysis, and you guys are going to be doing this anyways when you start writing your own essays, but I want to look at it from the lens of the second application when we apply it to the rhetorical situation, to analyzing the work of someone else. We look at who's the author, what's their purpose, and who they're trying to reach, and ultimately kind of figure out whether or not they are successful or effective. Not whether or not we agree, but whether or not they are successful. So, when talking about the rhetorical situation and rhetorical analysis, these are the questions that you guys should be asking. So let's look at the exigence, and I am going to, just as an FYI, I'm going to be looking at each of these elements with Dana Boyd's Why America is Self-Segregating, your article that you were supposed to read for the week. I'm going to look at that article and kind of apply the elements of the rhetorical situation to that. So, exigence. It's the problem, incident, or situation causing the writer to write the piece. So think about it like this. Nothing happens in a vacuum, and that includes the creation of any text. Essays, speeches, photos, political ads, any kind of text is written in a specific time and or place, all of which affect the way the text communicates its message. And to understand the rhetorical situation of a text, we have to identify a particular occasion or event that prompts the text creation at the particular time it's created. So, for example, was there a debate about the topic that the author of the text addresses? Did something happen in the world to prompt this piece to be written? Um, is it a specific occasion that renders this particular piece to be written? And you can look at that like with something like the inaugural address, which is the speech that the president gives every election coming up. We are coming up to an election season. So, inaugural address, it's written because someone is elected president, right? That's the exigence. If we look at Dana Boyd's article, Why America is Self-Segregating, part of why she's writing that piece, or part of what has happened to call it, like, her source of exigence is what? It's the creation of the internet, but more specifically, things like social media, things like Facebook, and things like Netflix. It's all of these kind of new ways of using the internet that she says, rather than bringing us together, further segregates us more. So, rhetorical situation and the exigence is the reason or the incident or the situation that prompts the writer to write. The rhetorical situation also includes the author, and there are really two types of authors. There's the implied author, or the image the author creates for him or herself, kind of a persona. And when you guys write, you kind of create this kind of persona of yourselves. I mean, think about it like from a comedian's point of view. You guys, if you are familiar with someone like Dave Chappelle or Kevin Hart, or, you know, I don't know, Jeff Foxworthy, or any number, Dane Cook, any number of comedians, they kind of create a persona or an image of themselves when they do their comedy. That's not necessarily the real them. It's like an over exaggerated caricature version of themselves. And the writer is kind of no different. You want to look at the image that the author creates. Some way, somehow, the author is going to give you some sort of indication about what they value or what they believe, and they are going to present themselves as someone that you can relate to, someone that you can trust, someone that you can believe, and they do that through their rhetorical. They do that through their language, and they usually establish themselves as someone who has some sort of experience or authority, someone who is invested in the topic. And if you look at the article by Dana Boyd, how does she kind of get us to relate to her, to trust her, to believe her? Well, she starts, I think, by really kind of using this kind of informality to kind of get us to kind of trust what she says. But she also does establishes her authority and her credibility through her use of relevant facts, support, evidence, data. She establishes herself as someone who knows what she's talking about. But she also establishes herself as someone who is credible by talking about her own personal experience, like when she was doing field work at that college campus. So it gives her this kind of firsthand experience, plus kind of an academic authority, someone that we want to trust, someone that we can believe, to say that, okay, I can trust what he or she is telling me. So the author, the implied author, the persona, the image, and then the other type of author we have is the actual them. And if you think back to what I was saying about the persona or the image created by the author, that may or may not, necessarily be the real them, but sometimes the implied author and the actual author are one in the same. So, author. Who's the author? What's their background? And how do they establish themselves as someone that we can trust? The rhetorical situation. The second component is the purpose. And the purpose is really, sometimes it's called the subject, but it's the author's goal. What's the author's argument or view on the subject? What's their stance? In other words, when we look at a text or an author's purpose, it means to look at the author's motivations for creating it. The author has decided to start a conversation or join one that's already underway. What has he or she decided to join in? In any text, the author could be trying to inform, to convince, to define, to announce, or to activate someone's behavior. And it could be a combination of any of those three. And I think that if we look at Dana Boyd's article, her argument is that our nation, rather than becoming more more diverse, we are becoming a nation that is self-contained with identity groups. And part of the reason that that's happening is because of things like social media, things like Netflix, the internet. And part of her purpose is to inform or convince us that, hey, this is happening. And another part of her purpose is to kind of make us aware of this so we don't fall into that trap of self-segregation. So, looking at the purpose, you want to think about what's the author trying to do. What is she or he? What's their motivation? Are they trying to inform, convince, define, announce, or activate? Okay. And the last component of the four is the audience. And to think about the audience, I want you guys to think about that no audience is a tabula rasa or a blank slate. All audience members, think about yourself for a second when you read things or when you see things. We all have our own kind of baggage that we carry with us day to day in the world, and that influences how we perceive issues, how we receive information, and how we process that knowledge. And think about the things that influence us as readers or as members of an audience: our gender, our age, our background, our ethnicity, our religious or political affiliations. All of those things, the things that make you who you are, the things that make you individuals, are the things that we carry with us as members of an audience. And those are things that you have to account for, or a text has to account for when looking at who they're going to address. So there are two types of audiences. One is the intended or the implied, and that basically means who the author wishes to address. Who are they targeting as their audience? And you can kind of tell who the intended or the target or implied audience is by looking at where an article is published. If it's in a magazine and a website, a journal, what is the title of that? Because the readership of those places kind of indicate who that target audience is. So, for example, if something is published in the New York Times, we can assume that the people that read the demographic that fits that audience is that they are probably middle to upper class. They have sort of a liberal stance or view of issues. And that tells us a lot about the intended or the implied audience. Um, if you look at page, page 219 at the bottom, we find out that Dana Boyd's article was first published on a blog called Points, Data and Society. And I had to use a little help from the Google to kind of figure out more about that blog. But I found out that people who read that blog or things that are written about in that blog are essays and pieces that kind of look at the relations between data, technology, and society. And it's my assumption, based on what I've read, is that the people who are the demographic, the target audience of this particular blog is people who are interested in technology, people who are media savvy, and people who are sort of they're educated. So what can we assume? And we don't really have to know all of that in order to kind of understand who Dana Boyd's target audience is because of the things that she uses as examples. She assumes that the people who are reading her article, are familiar with things like Netflix, things like Facebook, things like social media, and the kind of advances or the advances of the internet and how that affects our society. So that if that's her intended audience, we can also look at the second type of audience, the real audience. And the real audience is who's actually reading, listening, or watching. And this is probably more often than not the audience that the audience of a text, because we, of course, I mean, how well do we fit into that intended or implied audience? I know for myself, I don't necessarily fit into that demographic because I'm not really media savvy. I'm not really technologically savvy. And yet I'm reading it anyway, and I'm still kind of connecting to it because I am familiar with, Netflix and things like that. So you want to look at who's the audience and what implications we can make about her implied or intended audience. Because the who she or he intends to address influences what's said and how it's said and received. So you also want to look at the tone, and you want to look at the way an author kind of crafts their language. Because what's tone? Tone is how something is said. And if you change your tone, you change the message and you change how it's received. So I'm going to come back to that in a different lecture, but think about it this way. If you ever heard that phrase, you catch more flies with honey than you do vinegar, it's kind of what I mean by tone. So you want to look at the tone of the author and how that affects um, how the author kind of crafts his or her words. So I have really quickly, I'm already talked too long, a little diagram that kind of highlights the intricacies of all of these elements. You have the writer, the audience, the subject, or kind of the content, or the purpose, the argument, or the claim. All of those things really overlap and are influenced by this kind of outside context. And I encourage you guys to look at this a little bit, because they all work together to create a text, to create meaning. And I know you're asking, so what? What's the point? Why do I care? Well, it's important to look at the rhetorical situation because effective text really balance all sides of that kind of, and I say triangle because it kind of looks like a triangle if you look at it kind of abstractly. But it really kind of balances each part. It accounts for every part of all of those three-ish parts. So I am going to stop here, and I'm going to talk about rhetorical strategies, the way and how an author can use rhetorical strategies to make their text more effective. So stay tuned. Let me know if you have any questions, and we'll talk more about our rhetorical analysis and rhetorical strategies in the next lecture.